Good evening. Let's talk about race differences in IQ before we get fines for doing this sort of thing. So the overall situation in America, USA, looks something like this. Of course, these are not real data being shown, but roughly the distribution looks like this. We got the Asians in the highest. They've got 110 or 7 or so IQ in the US. We got the whites population with 100 or so, I think. This one is like at 105, probably because it's using different norms. Anyway, you get the order of the race distribution. It works like this. So though you can find black people at 140 and you can find white people at 55, they differ in the proportion of people you find there. So of course that also means that that's the population level, and you can then look at people who want to get in some kind of education. And so here we have the LSAT. I believe that's the one the lawyer people take, and we've got these various different race ethnic groups here, and you can see who's kind of having which distribution. The Puerto Ricans, they seem to be doing not very well. The African Americans are in the second in the bottom, very similar to the native Hawaiians. Up in the top we've got the no response people. These are probably kind of woke people who are smart, but they don't want to fill out their race, so they're pretending to be having no race, and so they're up here. After that, you've got the white people, the Caucasians. Asians are also here in the middle. I guess they don't like being lawyers so much. It's a verbal tilt thing, right? You can also look at the SAT, the math achievement gap over time. This data is the 2007 to 2014, so a bit late or a bit delayed. Here we have the SAT over time, and you can see this line here is the black-white gap. It's been essentially been hovering around 0.9 standard deviations for the last 20 years here. That's more or less what you expect. So you can really see that these gaps are large, and they're very consistent over time. Then after you're done with your education, you go to the job market and you get some jobs. Say you become an accountant, or you become a teacher of primary education, K-12 teacher, or a nurse, or a social worker, or whatever. And so because there's some filtering to getting into these jobs, and so people who make it into a given job will be smarter than the people who didn't, but the filtering is not perfect, right? And so what you can see is that the IQs of Europeans who made it as accountants, well, that IQ turns out to be 111 according to Charles Murray's calculations, and for Africans it's 100, and for Latinos 104. So you get the same kind of hierarchy within occupations, except it's more squeezed together and moved upwards. And you can kind of do that across the different kind of workers, and you can do, for instance, some of the works, the gaps are larger, like social workers. You have a 10-point gap here. It's 11 here. Some of them may be larger, janitors, and so on. But overall, you can compute the D value within the job, so that's not based on the total sizes. So you can see that white teachers, as compared to other teachers, are 1.35 standard deviations higher IQ is turns out to be here. So really, when you're hiring one of these people, the data shows that indeed the Europeans will be smarter and thus better workers than the Africans or the Latinos, even within the same occupation. And there are meta-analyses of job performance that bear these results out, that the measured work performance is indeed higher for Europeans than for Africans in the same jobs. So let's talk about the UK. The UK is the kind of original little brother of America, the first of the Anglos, and well, aside from the real Anglos down in South Jutland. And we got this recent paper, 2021, in Mankind Quarterly. So John and Richard Lynn, they looked at the ethnic distribution of differences in the intelligence, cognitive ability of adolescents. So these are the kind of children below 16 or so. And this is their summary statistics. Because there's been a lot of debate in recent years about the race ethnic gaps in the UK, and it's not for no reason. So if we just define the whites as 100, we can convert everybody else into the same scale. And so if we look at the GCSE, that's the some kind of school test that everybody's talking about, because the blacks essentially are only 2 IQs below the whites now, which is pretty weird by many things. So the environmentalists are saying that, yep, in the UK, indeed, they've got the holy grail. They've finally invented super environment that make black people as smart as white people, aside from the two IQs. Okay, but we can still see the Caribbeans are a bit low, so maybe they haven't gotten the juice yet, or the magic dirt, whatever it is. And you can see everybody else up here is kind of above the whites, except for the Pakistanis. But we have some problems here because there's these other four data sets, and when you look at those, you don't necessarily get the same results. And so, for instance, if we look at the cat-free, you see that the Africans are down to 91 now. And here the Pakistanis are also at 90, 92 or so. In PISA, they're also at 92, 92, 93, maybe if you round it, 93 in the CM test. So basically, the results are a bit strange. You can also see, like, say, the Chinese, they're 113 over here, but now they're 107 over here, 114 over here. Indians are now much higher, but over here they're down there. Now it's up here. You can see that the results are a bit of a mess. And you might even get conspiratorial and say, like, someone tampered with the GSCE data, because it looks like someone put the thumb on the weight and kind of raised the IQs of the non-whites. Or it has something to do with the weird school selection and this kind of test, because you can, as I recall, choose which exams you have to do in this one, so the score is not necessarily comparable. The job market in the UK, these results we just looked at here, these are for children and for adolescents. And so we might just wonder about, what about adults? Because, okay, maybe you get some weird results for the kids, but maybe they go away. Or maybe the result data back it up. We wanna be checked to be sure. Adult data is harder to get because, well, when kids are in schools, you can just be a teacher and go tell them, well, today you're doing this test, and that's just how it is. Remember, school is slavery, so you're gonna do whatever you're gonna do in the school. But adults, well, I guess you could draft them to the military, but being that aside, that would be only the men in most countries, and so you really just have less data for adults. So we don't really have that much good data for the adults in the UK. John has another meta-analysis coming out with the adult data, which I recall is more pessimistic than the kids data for the UK. But since it's not currently published, then we'll ignore it for now. However, we can look at the job market, which is downstream. So kids become adults, and then they become people who study educations, and then they become people on jobs. So we can kind of just look at the job market, which is in some sense what we really care about, because it's the thing that matters. Are the job market gaps in the UK, are they smaller, or are they similar to the US? So that's really what I was interested in. So I did the study, the intelligence gap between black and white survey workers on the Prolific platform. And Prolific, for those who haven't heard of it, it's a survey platform, and you can buy survey data there, and you can ask people whatever it is you want, and there's no one has to approve your study or whatever. It's just private sector. So it's actually easier to do research, ironically, if you're not in university than when you are in university, because no one is gonna come, whine in your classes. You won't have like the mandatory 5 vote fat 20 students or whatever. So you want to do something like that. Anyway, the real reason we're using Prolific data is because they're free, and they're from a different study, I believe by Gignac and Bates, who bought this data, and they were in fact studying the effects of motivation on doing well on intelligence tests. But since their data is public, I've just downloaded them and reanalyzed them for this other purpose. And so we're really just looking in these data because they're easily available, and they just happen to be relevant for us here. But it also is that survey data are important for other reasons, because a lot of people, use them for all kinds of studies. And if these studies may have some issues, then you kind of throws doubt on the entire thing. So speaking of survey research, you can think of what kind of errors there are in survey research. Everybody, hates on survey research because we know people aren't perfectly accurate subjects. They kind of make mistakes, or they fill out things incorrectly, maybe even do it on purpose, like kind of being dishonest. And so you can kind of get this, what Scott Alexander called the lizard man's constant, which is that no matter what absurd question you ask in surveys, some small proportion of people are always going to fill in the opposite. Maybe they just think it's fun. Indeed, I believe that lizard men are controlling the world, and the moon is made of cheese, right? There's also the other problem is that you try to make a survey, but the questions are just too difficult. So because the IQ follows the normal distribution, some people well, they're reading like fifth graders. So if you make survey questions very complicated, well, they don't understand what it is you want, and so they're just going to fill them out kind of incorrectly. Um, there is a problem of honesty. Honesty is related to intelligence, but not that strongly. But there are also race differences in honesty. So essentially, if you're trying to do survey research and you want to compare, say, black people and white people on some kind of thing like tipping in restaurants or something like this, well, you're relying on people's self-report accuracy. And if some people are more honest than others, or some races are more honest than others, and your data may be fucked up. We know this is true because when we look at crime rates, when we look at any objective measures like police records or people in like victim surveys, this sort of thing, we see large gaps. But when we ask people about how criminal they themselves are, then the race gaps are much smaller. That's of course because there are more liars in the among the blacks than there are among the white people, so they misreport their own criminal behavior to be less than it is. Taken together though, survey data is very important for much of research, and even government statistics is often based on self-report, like census data, like what job do you have, how much money you're making, this sort of thing. It's likely to, we know it varies by intelligence and thus also race. And so we are really interested in, are there race differences in survey takers on, say, prolific? Because as we saw with the with this kind of thing, we know that the race gaps for intelligence are present within every occupation examined, and so it stands to reason that the survey taker should also have this kind of race gap, which then has these unfortunate effects on honesty. So we just use the prolific data because that's what people are using nowadays, and it's because we have data. One pernicious problem of this race difference in honesty is that if you do some modeling methods, and you're looking for like interactions or strengths of association between races, or between variables, and there are differences such that by race they're filled out less accurately, then it looks like the relations between your variables are weaker in, say, the blacks than they are in the Hispanics, or the whites or the Asians or the Jews or whatever, or the people with higher education or the lower education, and that's because there are more survey errors with the lower intelligence people. And so, right, you get this spurious result that the association is weaker in these people, whereas in fact the association may be the same, and it's just caused by survey data being more bogus. So the main results of this study, there are 3 samples, kind of large, 1,000 or so, each of them. They don't have that many test items. They used 3 different sets of tests, 24 items, 10 items, 20 items. Being that as it is, we can compute a g-factor based on these items, and we can compute what the reliability of this test is, and then you can adjust for this reliability. Of course, if you give people a very short intelligence test, then the intelligence test has a lot of measurement errors. Some people get lucky, some people get less lucky, so you remove this effect. And when you adjust the effect size, then you get this. So these are the gaps you see. Once you adjust for the measurement error, you get 0.91, 1.00, 0.88. So the gaps are slightly less than 1 standard deviation overall, but most of the data comes from this sample, and you can see why. When you look at the sample sizes, there are 1,000 people here, but only 18 of them are black. 900 or so are white. Down here it's 1,200 white people, 28 black people. So essentially these 2 studies are contributing about 50 people, right? That's not very impressive, and so that's why you can see here that the confidence interval is huge. So really, this 1C study, which had many more black people, that one is really one that's giving most of the data. So that's the one that found 1 standard deviation, and it's based only on 10 items. So, it has a smaller test, and that's just how things are. So what you do is that you meta-analyze these 3 studies, and you give more weight to this study because it has more, it's more precise, as you can see with the confidence interval is much narrower. And once you do that, then the overall effect size is a 0.99, which of course corresponds to a 14.8 IQ. So that's what you see in the prolific people here. So these are UK samples. The overall unadjusted result was 83. There's not much interest. There's no detectable heterogeneity in this, so the results didn't seem to be, they didn't vary across studies more than you expect by chance. And that's also because, of course, these 2 studies are very uncertain. So, so overall, we find that that the gap is quite large here. There's also the question of test bias. some of the UK blacks will be recent immigrants, and so the test may be biased against them, especially if it's some kind of vocabulary test. Um, so we looked for this also, and we find that one test had a 0.05 bias. There's some uncertainty about this value too, because these can happen by coincidence. So you may want to subtract 5% from this, but that would only be 5% difference, which is kind of tiny. So overall, I didn't include that in meta-analysis, but if you were to do that, then you'd have to subtract a little bit from this number. For those who are curious about the test bias, the way you really do it is that every item you model that as having a probability of being passed, of getting the item correct, and that should be a function of your level of intelligence. And so for each race, you can fit items, and you can get this kind of curve, a logistic curve. So when you only see the red line, it's because the whites and the blanks are on top of each other, so the lines are the same. So there are two items where the test seems to be biased. Here, this PFA3, you see that as a function of the black people intelligence, they're not much more likely to get this item correct, whereas as a function of white people intelligence, it is. So this test item does not work very well for black people. And up here, what you get is that the opposite, is that this test item works better for black people than for the white people, but the difference is less than this one. So this item favors the white people, this item favors the black people, and they cancel out to some extent. But this having a larger effect results in this tiny overall bias. So that's how it works. The other items did not show any bias. And really, we really expect this to be a false positive finding of bias, because this is a paper folding test. So it's people about rotating some paper stuff in their head. And it's a bit difficult to see any kind of language bias with this. And it's okay, white people have slightly better spatial ability, so maybe the reason that this one is because it's attacking some spatial ability, but then doesn't explain this one. I would think it's a coincidence. And if they were to redo this one, we probably wouldn't get the same result. That being said, the summary of the study then is that data from the UK show that for children there are smaller race gaps. Especially the black ones are even getting to parity with the whites, which is kind of interesting. Of course, that could be due to cheating on the tests more, or these kind of self-selection biases with the tests, or maybe the recent African immigrants are much more elite than the previous ones. The older African immigrants in the UK are these like Caribbean, from these islands in the Caribbean that the United Kingdom doesn't want to give up. So these old colony subjects, they just migrate to the UK. The recent African, the black Africans, so to say, these are the kind of doctors and stuff you get from Nigeria and Ghana and these kind of people. So it's a doctor from Ghana is probably going to be 100 IQ or not 200, but 120 or so, and there's going to be some regression towards the mean. If you then test their kids, it's not so unthinkable that they would be about 100 IQ. That seems about right. In the US, you see the same thing with Indians. Indians in India have IQ of 82 or give or take, whereas the children of Indian immigrants in the USA, they have IQs of 110 or so. So this fits with the elite migration pattern. For the UK, adult data are missing. So we looked at this online survey data just because we had it. It looks like the survey gap among people who take these kind of surveys is roughly it's 15 IQ. More or less the same as normal. Test bias was either very small or minimal. I think it's a false positive, but maybe it is. Maybe these two items really should be thrown out. More adult data are really needed to clarify them, and there's this meta-analysis by John and Pesta, I think, that will be coming out at some point. This also shows a similar, maybe not 15, but maybe 13 IQ gap for the adults. So this really brings us to the hypothesis. Maybe there is a real, a difference between the cohorts. So the African kids in the UK are smarter than the African adults, because the African kids are the offspring of recent African migrants who are much more elite. Maybe there's some bias on these the test bias. It can be because the people select some of the tests. Maybe they purposefully made the test biased against white people, the white kids. I mean, it's not totally unreasonable. In the UK, they let immigrants rape their kids and this sort of thing. So maybe they would also bias the tests. We don't really know. They don't really publish the data, so we can't test it for bias. For the GSSE, I think you can choose which subjects you want to get tested in, and this may result in some kind of like maybe the Africans just pick the easier subjects to get higher grades. There's the issue of test prep. There's often what the case is that a lot of money is being given to test preparation for minorities or for non-whites so that they could get higher scores, and so there's more test preparation being given to the non-whites, and this boosts their scores even though their IQs are not higher. They just appear to be higher IQ because they had more training on the tests. There's also the possibility that the government is actually frauding the data, since there are some like mysterious patterns and even variation across studies of like 15 IQ points, which is like hard to explain. Um, Maybe those are sampling errors. Maybe there's some weird thing going on. I wouldn't rule it out, but I mean, it is pretty strange for Western governments to engage in data fraud with this sort of thing. But they've been telling us for 100 years now that we need to close these ethnic gaps, and maybe one way of closing the ethnic gaps is just changing the numbers. That being said, this is a short study. You could read it out if you're more interested. And until next time, bye bye.